Hello and welcome to another video. Now, I just jumped right into this video because I wanted to demonstrate and talk today about procrastination and why we procrastinate and what gets in the way. Now, oftentimes, there's a lot of culprits that get involved and get in our way. But there's two really big ones that come in very often, and this is perfectionism and imposter syndrome. And what's cool about this is I'm going to talk to you about some simple, easy ways you can get through this. Now, to work through perfectionism and imposter syndrome, it's pretty simple. I'm just going to keep it simple. You have to endure the silence. What does that mean? Oftentimes in this modern day world, people are so busy with distractions, and we're always trying to get away from the voices inside our head. And that's oftentimes because there's a lot of criticism and there's a lot of doubt. And so what happens is we have a lot of these broken thoughts inside our heads. And what's very interesting is most people, I would say, probably don't know how to actually properly think. Because broken thoughts are thoughts that haven't completed all the way through. And most people, when they have thoughts, they'll think something to the effect of like, okay, I want to do this, but I have to go do this and this instead. But in order to do that, and then by the time they get to that thought, an interruption or some distraction comes in and cuts it off. And what happens is before you know it, when you do that a couple hundred times, you basically have this graveyard of thoughts in your mind. And I say it's like a graveyard because it is just a bunch of the thoughts that have not completed. And like a graveyard, it's filled with a bunch of dead bodies, and dead bodies are, decaying. And so when we have a lot of thoughts that we don't complete because from the time we were teenagers, we've essentially spent more time listening to other people than ourselves, or something gets in the way, that eventually we build all these sort of dead bodies of thoughts in our heads. And so those turn to like negative, difficult ones because we haven't been able to process or feel those out. And when they build and build and build and build and build, we create a life to sort of keep any thought from happening. And so we build protections against this through our perfectionism. Because perfectionism is just a defense mechanism against these broken thoughts. When you have a lot of them, you begin to try to make everything perfect, do everything right. It's your brain's way of having less and less of these thoughts. But conversely, what happens is it actually creates more and more of them, because you get stuck in this cycle of thinking and never actually fulfilling and completing anything. Because when a thought fills all the way through, it will instinctively lead to some type of creation, action, or result in the real world. But most thoughts can never get to that point because, once again, they're broken because of things like our cell phones, TV, radio, or you could I'll call them shallow relationships, when we kind of just use people to get away from our own thoughts. Usually, a good symptom of that is if you're terrified of being alone, that's a good indicator that you have a lot of broken thoughts and then you're dealing with a graveyard. So How do we deal with this? Because this is a very difficult emotion to go through, right? It's a lot to kind of endure. So we have to recognize most broken thoughts. And if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know most broken thoughts are on the bottom of the scale. So the shame, guilt. And so whatever we do, like always, we just go with our 3 steps. We need to feel and identify what our feelings are with each of the thoughts, right? Because once you can identify the feeling, now you're actually attaching to the basis of that thought, because thinking actually comes here. And so this thought then, because you've identified the feeling of what's going on or what was going on there, now you can see what's the natural conclusion. And the natural conclusion, when you say, well, what is that thought? What does that actually lead me to do? That will create a decision which will lead in some type of action or creative process. And once again, action doesn't always necessarily mean something you're physically doing. Even though it does translate there, what action really means is you make a fundamental decision about whatever thought that is. And how you'll know that it's a full thought is that you will come to this place. This is the natural result of true thinking. If you just kind of have a thought, but it doesn't lead to anything creative, a decision or an action, what you're probably describing is what we would call a mentation, which is like a thought because it uses the same faculties, but it's just an echo of unresolved feelings. And almost always, if you're having mentations, which is 80% of your thoughts day to day are the same level of thoughts. And if these thoughts, they run like a subroutine in the background, which makes you facilitate your life or whatever. Now, obviously, you don't need to be conscious of every single thought you're having. And you have about 50 to 60,000 thoughts a day. So the idea is when you're having true, deep thinking, when you're able to move through silence, a lot of the conscious thinking you're having is coming from this inability to make a decision, make an action, or make a creative decision. And that's because you're oftentimes going through the echoes of unresolved feelings. So what do you need to do? Well, feel and identify the feeling, put words to it, right? Once you can put words to it, then you'll understand the nature of the thought. Now, if it's a shameful thought, you'll know, okay, well, this is not a shame, this is a shameful thought. And then you'll naturally move up the scale to guilt, to apathy, and the desire, fear, wrath, anger, then eventually courage. And when you cross courage, then you can make a decision. And you just spend time with that thought. And the thing is, if a lot of this is confusing, oftentimes it's because you haven't been sitting in silence. As you sit in silence and you identify the feelings, you will notice the natural pattern of your thinking. And as you sit with that and you don't distract it, you don't go to the phone, you don't go to the book, you don't go to the person, but you sit with the thought by initially identifying the feeling. It's super important that you know what you're feeling first. Because then once you go through that feeling, then you'll know the full train of the thought. And then you will arrive at the action or decision. And you will have that insight. Because what will happen is it'll create awareness. Because true thinking always creates awareness. And then from that awareness, you will then be able to make a decision or gather an insight. And from that insight, again, it just creates decisions. Because all insights lead to awareness, and awareness changes a facet of our being or a way we decide to move in something. Oftentimes it's by checking whatever insight we have and how we're going to apply it, right? So insight, when insight moves to application, this is when you know you're doing true thinking and you're not just mentating. And if you want to be able to move past procrastination and truly evolve, you need to be able to stand and sit in awareness and know how to go into true thinking, true deep thought, because that will come with creative action. And this will then allow and give space to application. And this is the natural consequence of all thinking. So if you're wondering what's the first step, identify what you're feeling, first and foremost, right? Anyway, if you have any questions, please like and subscribe. And put any questions on the material down below. This is a pretty quick one today. I wasn't procrastinating, I just wanted to do it, and I realized I had to just jump in and do it, and not overthink it too much, right? Because when you overthink it, again, that's just coming from a lack of action, and oftentimes that's just coming from desire and anxiety down here beneath the courage threshold when we're overthinking, right? Which again is the echo of unresolved feelings. So for me, that feeling oftentimes vacillates between fear and apathy. A lot of fear and a lot of shame when I don't feel like I'm getting things done, or I don't feel like what I'm doing is enough. But that's a common thing we all go through, especially when we're starting something new and we're not sure it's even working, right? But then as we continue to make decisions, we gain awareness, and then from that awareness we grow insight and application. But in order to gain awareness, we have to decide our intent. But again, intent comes after we identify our feelings, because once we have our intent, now we can be aware of what our thinking is, and then this will lead to a decision or an action. And recognize everyone has intent, even like the smallest little kids, right? Kids are actually hyper aware of their own intents typically, even if they can't always articulate it. Anyway, hope all that is well and that's making some sense. That's the secret to breaking through your procrastination. Identify what you're feeling. Then when you identify the thoughts, identify the intent behind the thoughts, and make a decision. And if you're like, well, this kind of thought isn't necessarily a thought I make a decision about, then you haven't identified what you're feeling yet. You need to identify what you're feeling. Because all thinking leads to decisions and creativity. That is the nature of the program. So oftentimes if it's stuck, like I said, it's just unresolved feelings. Hope all is well. Stay happy, stay healthy. Peace.